settings from the ad set into the sheet. What we want to do as a next step is actually pull the metrics and some numbers into this as well. So we'll do that with the SUMIF formula or SUMIFs formula, and build a little bit of a dynamic dashboard that allows you to choose different dates and then basically look at the different performance of the different time frames that way. But I hope that we're all at the same stage essentially. So we have the ad set ID here. We know that this is kind of our key, right? Because we have ad sets, and this is kind of our starting point. Of course, we're using VLOOKUPs and array formulas right now. It is, of course, possible to use index match formula as well. So if anybody wants to do that, that's obviously also fine. The downside of index match is that it doesn't support array formulas. So it is a little bit more flexible. Basically, VLOOKUP only works with taking whatever you basically use as the lookup key, needs to be always in the first row. So if we had, for example, campaign ID as a starting point, or name as a starting point, or the ID was actually not in column A but column E, then we wouldn't be able to use VLOOKUP to go from column E to look up a value from column B. So that's only possible with an index match formula, where essentially we're telling we're using the index, where we define the overall range that we want to use, and then we'll basically give it a row and a column. So this works really easy. For example, if we want row 3 and column 2, then we would expect it to output us this number. Actually, let's maybe use column 4, so we have a name. And when we do that, as we see here, it's exactly what we'd expected, right? Row 3, column 4, this is kind of where we end up, as we can see here. And of course, this can be used dynamic again with a match formula, right? So if we say, hey, the range, we want to find out by finding this particular ID, right? Find this particular ID. So actually, I'm going to say find, let's look for this 5,000. So we're going to look for 5,000, and we're going to look for in this column. Now we can see that we looked for 5,000 in this column. That basically chose the row. So the row is 4 because it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we looked at, so we said, okay, this evaluates to 4. And then the column we had already specified, which was 4. So this was picked out. And we could also just say, hey, for this, we want to go somewhere else. We want to match something else. I'm not going to go into that too much, because I think this is already a super flexible and very powerful tool to be used. What I'm going to do for now is mark this in gray. I like doing this. I also like grouping this. And then so basically, if you are the person that is building dashboard and then you want somebody else to use it, you can hide essentially the things that you don't want people to touch ever. And so that's a really convenient way. Sometimes make it in italic as well. Italic, exactly. And then also in this case, the ad set ID, for example, actually campaign ID, I really don't care about. So I'm just going to remove that for now. And ad set ID, I also really don't care about as a starting point. So oftentimes I will also group that or hide it. And then, this looks already much more like something that we would want to use. Ad set name, we, I think, want to include everything that we have here. Exactly. So something that you may have kind of seen is that the bid amount is actually, my account is in euros. So this right now shows up in cents. So, this could be a little bit confusing, but of course, you can easily just divide it by 100 and it will hopefully work equally well. Let's take here. So that was supposed to go here. there we go. And so I did that now, and I want this whole thing to be formatted in euros because that is what I have here. So this works well. Something that you can do as well is if you want this 100 to be dynamic, I sometimes like using these formulas here, but I think right now this works perfectly fine. So we know that this ad set has this bid amount, and this is something that we know for a fact. So now let's start basically pulling some insights data. And so the way that you would normally do this is with a sum if formula. And the sum if formula, I'm just gonna start something, looking for spend, for the spend. And so the way that we normally would use a sum if formula is we have a range that we check and compare against some criterion, and then we have a range where we sum. And so I'm just going to do this in a really easy way for now. So we want to have the spend data, so we can just go into the insights data here, and then just mark the whole column E. This is where we know we want to. Sorry, this is our sum range. Apologies. So this is our sum range. Let me add 2 commas here. So we know this is our sum range. And then for where we want to, how we want to make the check is we always just want to do it on the first column, right? We have our ad set IDs in here, and we know that if we take the ad set IDs and compare all of the ad set IDs with this ad set ID that we have here, then we'll be able to get that. So I'm just gonna move over here so we know it's in B5. And when I press that, what we'll see now is that for this ad set, we do actually have 33 euros spent. So one thing that I'm going to do now is I'm going to lock again the columns. So I always want to look up, my starting point is always column A. That's where the ad set ID is. And I also always want to, here in this sheet, basically use column B, or the values in column B to look up. So I'm just going to copy paste this down here. As you can see, nothing crazy is going on, not a lot of spend for any of those ad sets. Exactly. And so this works really well, but it's not exactly dynamic. As you can see now, we have a little bit of the problem that we had before with the VLOOKUP, where we now need to go and select the exact range that we want to choose, that we want to that we want to sum over, essentially. So what we'll use actually is, also, this is not exactly dynamic in that it allows us to, check for dates or something like that. So usually it's a better idea to actually immediately start with a sum ifs formula, because the sum ifs formula works exactly the same way, only it puts the sum range at the beginning. So the sum range now needs to go at the beginning. And then we put the criteria range afterwards and the criterion afterwards. And now we can add multiple criteria ranges and criterions. So if I just copy paste this works really well too. And so this now is already a little bit better. And so one thing that I want to do is I want to say, you know what, let's actually, okay, I made the wrong way here. Let me add some here. Yeah, I think that works fine. So we have our ad set ID, we have our events here, and what we can do now is we can actually use a similar function to basically sum over the correct column. And so this is a little bit tricky. So we now know that if let's say we have impressions here, with spend here, impressions here, we basically now want to go into this whole range, right? Into this whole range and say, find where it says impressions and use that column as the summing column, the sum range. And the way that we can do that is actually using an index formula. And so I showed you before how the index formula works. And so something that we can do when you use an index formula is either you can specify one particular point, right? As we did before, we specified, this range, for example. We said, hey, I want row 3 and column 2. And we got one value. But if we say, I don't actually care what row, we can just leave this empty, just say column 2. And so what will happen now is we'll actually get a range. And so this now is very interesting for us, because that means now, instead of us trying to tell it, hey, if we want spend, then go into column E. If we want impressions, go into, I don't know what other column. But what we can actually say is we can we can try and use this index formula to actually give us a range, and then dynamically use that to sum over these values. So the way this works is that we now need this impressions data. So I'm going to keep the spend formula over here. And over here, I'm just going to paste the impressions data. And I pressed Control-Shift-V, which copy-pasted only the value, which meant that the format of this stayed the same. If I hadn't done that, then it would have looked like that. But since we kind of want to keep our lookup values, or the ones that define the dynamic input, we keep them right now in italic and this light gray. So what we'll do is I'm just going to basically copy this whole thing over here. And so, of course, this won't work now, because we're now summing over this insights E. So what we'll try and do is, actually, we know already that we have this whole table from A to G where we have data. And maybe we want to add some further actions like subscription events or purchase events. So I'm actually going to say let's remove this and use the index formula. And so we know that this index formula, this basically should output the range that we want to sum over. So we already have the condition range or criteria range and our criterion, but now we want to have a dynamic way of looking this up. And so it works really, really easily. So what we say is, as the starting point, we'll use all of this, maybe until K or L even, just to do that. So we'll say it's insights exclamation mark, and then A to K. And again, we'll use dollar signs to fix it. And then, well, rows, we don't want to have a particular row, because we want all of the rows, right? We want a range. We want to specify the whole column. And so that works well. So we just put a comma. We just don't want to put a row here, but we do want to have a column. And how do we choose the column? Well, with a match formula. And we know already how to do this. We can say, well, I care about looking this thing up. So we care about H4. We want to look for impressions in this whole range, right? And I'm just going to choose A1 to K1 now. And so what we'll say is, hey, I have this whole range. Look for this value impressions, open bracket / impressions. Find that determines the column number, and then we'll just take all rows. So this works really well. So I made a mistake here. So for our match to work, we need, this is a little bit annoying. So we need H4. So we need H4. We'll look up in this whole range. We want a match type of 0, a search type of 0, and that's it. I think I entered one too many formulas. Number of expected arguments. So let me take a look again. So we have index opening here. We have reference, row, and then column. So this should be that. And then we just need to get rid of this bracket at the end. So that worked. So we now have a value here, 5,083. I'm going to make sure that we lock this row. We always want to look for values in row 4, right? So the spend data we're going to put over here. So I'm just going to lock row 4 with the $sign. And then I'll also lock everything about this thing. So either you can press F4 and that will automatically lock all of them, all of the values, or you can do it dynamically. So if I now copy paste this below, as you can see here, and weirdly I have a different font size, so I'm just going to copy paste the value. So now we have Arial and 10. So now we can see the impressions here. And so let's replace our initial spend data. So we know that we have these 3 more metrics that we care about. So we have the spend data. Instead over here, we have link clicks here, and we have mobile app installs here. Move all of those and make sure that this one is formatted correctly. And so if we do this now, it's worked fine, right? So this is now completely dynamic. So what we can do now is we can actually just copy paste it over here, and this will do a good job, okay? We don't actually have any data here, so that didn't work. We can now give it any name that we want, right? So we can call it link clicks, and we could just say, well, let's just call it clicks, and here maybe it's just installs. So again, row 5 is basically our custom labels, right? It's just kind of like the pretty name that we want, and then these ones are used dynamically to pull this up. So this works really well for any metrics that we have, right? So if we had any further metrics, if we had 10 more metrics, then all of these would be looked up dynamically. And so now we still don't have any kind of dates or anything like that in here. But one thing that we can actually do is we can make all of these inputs completely dynamic. So what how this will work is that we just add a new formula, right? Because we already know that we have these two columns here, which are basically the start date of the time frame of a certain date, of a certain data set or like data input. Each row just belongs to one day, right? So this column C is kind of irrelevant. We don't need it. But column B we can use to look up the value. And so something that we can say is, hey, we see different dates here, but let's get all impressions from 27th of June until 2nd of July for a particular ad set. So let's do that. So 27th of June till 2nd of July. So we just do this here. We could just say 27th of June this year, right? I don't know if this is the correct formatting. Let me do it differently. And then we want to say actually here, maybe 2nd of July. And so one thing that you can usually check whether this is actually seen as a date input is when you double click on it, and then now we can see this is actually, we can actually pick a date here. And so what we can do is we can say, this whole thing should work very similarly. What we want to do now is we want to look up the correct column, right, column B, and find for all values that are larger or equal to this and smaller or equal to this. So we can do this really easily. We can just add more criterions. So even though this looks super confusing, this is still this whole thing is just the sum range. This is our criterion range, and this is our criterion. So we can just add more criterion ranges. So I'll do this now. Clearly that didn't work. So I'm just gonna say insights, ! And it's B. And we could also make this dynamic, right? We could, kind of put this date start value somewhere, but it's not really something that needs to be dynamic right now because we can guarantee that the date will always be there, and we only need this kind of once. And so what we want to look at now is you can see this already here. If we don't have to just say if we did this, basically what we would do now is we'd say what is the spend on this particular day, and we can do this, and we can see that I'm just gonna press F4 and fix it. We can see that for all of these ad set, the exact spend was actually 0. I have no idea why, really, to be honest. Shouldn't be the case, but it's exactly 0. And but what we can do is we could just say add this larger or equal to and the ampersand. Now we have basically all spend after or on the 27th of June. And so now we just need to add the same formula and say and less or equal to this date. So we can just copy paste this whole thing, copy this over and say now we have less or equal to H2 and copy paste it over here. And now this whole thing is completely dynamic, as we said before. We don't have actually any values here. So let's try and find some actual values. And this should all be dynamic. And now we found something. So you can see that here. All right, so something happened here, right? And you can see this is dynamic. All right, so clearly around these dates, there was some type of spend happening, but not before and not after. All right. Well, hopefully you have a little bit more data to play around with. But this is a dynamic now. And so the really cool thing is that if we now want to give it to somebody else who actually uses it and works with it, we can just mark it. I like marking it as input variables or like input fields in light yellow. So you could just say date start or date stop. But also maybe people know already how to use it. And so if we did this, now this already looks a little bit like we might actually be able to use it. And so of course what we don't have yet is we don't have any calculated metrics. So again, this is, I think, probably one of the easier exercises. How about we add some CPM, CTR, and maybe CPI, right? So cost per 1,000 impressions, cost per miller, click-through rate, clicks divided by impressions, and then cost per installs, which is spend divided by installs. So just do this, spend divided by impressions times 1,000. And we probably want this to be something like that. And of course, again, we can use an array formula. So if I just press Control or Command Shift Enter, this is what will happen. And now we just need to say, do this across the whole range. And then we have these weird numbers again. So we'll say either we do a if error. It's probably a good idea. Let's do if error. All right. So the formatting clearly didn't work too well. So I'm just going to copy paste special format only. Good formatting. And I'm just going to copy this over to the CPM bit. We know it's not the right numbers, but actually what we want to do is we want to calculate column F by I. So this is our CPI. Not by that, not multiplied by 1,000. All right, so this works well. Copy paste format only. Cool, and then we just need CTR. So this is clicks divided by impressions, and of course we want this to be show as a percentage, and we actually again want this to be an array formula. And use the if error as well. Oh, do this inside. Right, and then we just need to copy paste the format. By the way, if you're wondering how I jump around so much, basically I'm pressing Control right now, and when you press Control and go and use the arrow keys, I will always jump to the next element, so to say. So if I, for example, have some value here and some value here, let's do this. If I go here and I press the arrow key right, I will go to the next kind of break, and then I will jump over to the next one. So I'm just gonna remove all of that. So we need to copy paste the format as well. Right, and so this is basically it. We now have the ad set name, we have the optimization event, we have the bid amount, we have the actual spend, we have the impressions, we have some metrics. Of course, we could now, for example, copy paste the whole thing over here and use a second time frame. So as we can see here, right now what we do is we basically copy pasted the whole thing, right? So we now have 2 time frames, and I'm just going to make sure to mark this. So I'm going to mark this green. This is like the settings kind of data. So I'm going to do purple, and then this is like the second time frame. So I'm going to mark it blue. And so what we have, the only thing that we didn't do right now is since we're using these absolute values, we should now refer back to this thing. So it should be M2 here and M2 here. And now we can just copy paste this over. There we go. So now let's use maybe the 13th of July here and the 14th of July here. And so now we can see that, there is like, I don't know, some stuff happening. Not super exciting, but this is what we can do. And of course, if we wanted to, and if kind of wanted to get into it, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. We could now also, have some type of comparison, right? So we could say maybe we usually want to look at today's data or yesterday's data. So we can also make this dynamic, of course, but we could just say it's CPI trend. And we'll just take this thing, divide it by, whatever it says here, and then use an array formula, SL, and of course, use the if error function around it so we don't have weird looking values popping up. And so now probably we want this to be percent as well. Make this bold, and maybe we would want to have some type of conditional formatting on this. So we say if it increases, then that's terrible. So say if the number is 0, then that's all fine. If the number is minus 0.5, that's great. And if the number is plus 0.5, then that's terrible, right? We had a 50% increase. So both of these are absolutely terrible. And then, of course, we could just copy this over. Copy this over as well and say maybe we want to do the same thing now for spend, right? So we want to have a CPI trend and spend trend. So this will be M divided by F6 to F. Yeah, and you can see this is kind of made up data, so the values are exactly the same. So that's very unlikely that would happen, but feel free to play around with this as you please. Cool. I think that basically concludes that part. I'm just going to remove this because it just doesn't look that good. I'm just going to conclude this here. So we now have some type of metadata or settings that we pulled from the assets sheet, and then we have the metrics for 2 time frames that we pull from the insights sheet. This is all fully dynamic. It's completely based on the metrics that we have here. So if we at least these 4 columns and these 4 columns, the actual raw data. So if we wanted to add any type of other data, so if you don't have installs, but rather adds to cart or purchases or whatever you want to look at, then this is the way to pull in that data. Yeah, it works completely dynamic. And of course, there's a lot more stuff that we could be doing. We could say, hey, let's look at the performance over time, for example, for a particular ad set, or let's look at all ads for one ad set, or etc. And the last thing that we want to do is also, show how we can, maybe prepare like an export that we then take and upload back to Facebook, so we can make live changes from within the Google Sheet.